It's so nice to see so many of you interested in these fascinating cases in the Supreme Court. And I hope many of you, as a result of what's happening right now in juvenile justice, develop an interest in juvenile defense, because it would be great to be part of the recruitment of new juvenile defenders who are very much needed around the country. Probably the most remarkable thing about this latest focus in the Supreme Court is that it raises more than just the sentencing questions, which are so important about what should happen to kids who are arrested for serious offenses, as Leslie has described. It really pushes for reconsidering the direct filing of children in adult court, and forces us to talk about, well, if kids are less culpable, why? And if the reasons that make them less culpable make sense to us, then does it mean that we are now thinking again about rehabilitation? Are we thinking that because kids are kids, they would do better with services to address what was behind their offense, and would then be safer because they would not only return to the community having not been locked up for many years with adults, but return after services that were addressing the reasons they got locked up in the first place. So one of the best outcomes of all of the attention to these Supreme Court cases, in my opinion at least, would be that regular citizens and legislators would be asking themselves the question, for this 14-year-old who was in the getaway car in the felony murder in one of the cases a couple of weeks ago, would I rather, as a citizen or a legislator, have that 14-year-old be eligible for parole and get out at age 50, having spent 14 to 50 in an adult prison or prisons, having never legally driven a car, never had a job, never been to school past the age of 14. Would I rather have that in terms of public safety, or have that 14-year-old get out after being in a juvenile facility for 5, 6, 7, in Oregon even longer years, having completed high school, in some situations having completed college while in that juvenile program, and also received other treatment and matured around other teens with a high staff-youth ratio rather than being in a prison with adults. And that seems to me to be a very simple, easy to answer question, which I'm very hopeful is what we could be thinking about at this point, rather than the simplification that is what direct file involves, which is adult crime, adult time. Which the more you think about these culpability questions or the adolescent development questions that I'm going to be talking about, the more you realize that that idea makes no sense at all. These aren't adult crimes. These are serious crimes committed by people who have all the characteristics you would expect of a 14-year-old, plus some significant disabilities and trauma in their histories. The Roper and Graham and Sullivan cases in the Supreme Court really shone a spotlight on adolescent development. A lot of the excitement at that time was over the brain studies that were MRI studies that found that teen brains actually develop through the adolescent years into the early 20s. And there was lots of attention to that since it hadn't been known before. It hadn't been presented as well as it was in the APA and the AMA briefs in those cases. But a really important aspect of those briefs in Roper and in Graham and in Sullivan was that they brought together years of child development research as well as the more recent MRI studies and made dramatic statements about adolescence that shook people up in thinking about this notion of what services are necessary to address the juveniles who are arrested for serious offenses. And on the chart that you'll find in your on the website, which is a chart up here, but you probably can't read, but I appreciate you putting it up here because it's useful for me to refer to as I talk. You'll see a couple of the striking quotes from the APA and AMA briefs in Roper, Graham, and Sullivan. So, for example, the premise of those briefs is that behavioral immaturity mirrors anatomical immaturity. So it establishes the idea that we can't expect 16 and 17-year-olds to behave like adults when they don't have the brains of adults. And paying particular attention to the frontal lobe development, which is responsible for impulse control and good judgment, which doesn't complete its development until after age 18. And the recognition, substantiated by MRI studies, that teenagers make most of their decisions through the center in their brain that is really the emotion center, rather than more sophisticated, considered decision-making. But if we look at the years of psychological research about teenagers, there's much more than what the MRI studies have found. And the way that I've chosen to organize my thinking about how do I understand what the developmental theories are that would be, and research that would be useful at figuring out how did that kid get to that getaway car? What was going on with that 14-year-old that he was there at the time? I have organized these research findings around 3 areas that seem to me come together for most of the juveniles that I've evaluated and presented in court. And I just want to give you an overview of those 3 areas and give you a flavor for how they come together. The first is immaturity, the second is disabilities, and the third is trauma. And the majority of kids that I have seen have all 3 that are there with them in the getaway car or on the street when they get involved in the offense that then gets direct filed in court. The immaturity area, of course, is obvious to all of you, except it is a lot more complicated than just saying, well, he's 14, so obviously he's immature. But all teenagers do show immature thinking, immature identity, and immature moral reasoning. These are normal for teenagers. These are the reasons that teenagers aren't allowed to make significant decisions like signing contracts or joining the military when they're under 18, because they don't anticipate the future very well. They're not able to see consequences of their actions very well. And something that was really focused on in the APA and AMA briefs in Roper and Graham is that teenagers are well known for taking risks because they don't think about the consequences of their actions. And one of those dramatic quotes that's up on that chart is that it is statistically aberrant to refrain from risk-taking in adolescence, something that some of you may remember yourselves. And so for that teenager in the getaway car who might be criticized in court for doing something dreadful, driving without a license, or being out at 3 o'clock in the morning, very risky things to do. In fact, put in context, those are pretty typical things for teenagers to do. Take risks and not see that anything worse could happen other than you might get into trouble for getting in after curfew, rather than you might be with a group that ends up committing a serious offense and ends up with a death. And even though you were in the getaway car not thinking about any of those things, you get charged with a felony murder. There's been a lot more attention to immature identity as well. And so the commonly recognized peer pressure, which frequently is seen in court as being a kind of ho-hum, everyone knows about peer pressure, actually is a large part of what is behind many of the offenses that kids get into. They're not only taking risks, but they are hanging around with other kids who are doing things, taking risks together. So another one of those great quotes is not only that kids are far more vulnerable to peer pressure than adults and spend far more time with peers than adults, but that most adolescent delinquent behavior occurs on a social stage where the immediate pressure of peers is the real motive. So it's not a delinquent motive. It's not to do the offense that kids are there. They're there because they want the approval and acceptance of their friends, much as they do many other things for approval and acceptance. And then lastly, there's been quite a bit of attention to immature moral reasoning, so that these days, sometimes in court, I'm actually able to get the court interested in the possibility that this could be a kid who does know right from wrong, as most of the kids I've evaluated do, but that at the time, because things were moving very quickly, because they were going along with a group of friends, because they were taking risks that they minimized, because they weren't thinking about the worst thing that could happen, at the time, their moral reasoning was suspended. They weren't able to think about how this could cause serious harm to someone. And that really applies to a lot of kids who carry weapons as a habit because they want to look big on the street because they're fearful, but where they never intended to use a weapon. They never thought about a victim before all of this happened. Many of the kids that I meet who are in shock, in detention after they've been arrested, say it was an accident. And of course, that's often made fun of in court. But in truth, often it was an accident. None of what happened was anticipated by the young person. And they're not the monster that they may have been painted as in the media. So immaturity is going to be in every juvenile that we work with, and it would be considered normal or typical of teenagers. But the other two parts of this framework in the chart that you would find on your website are not normal, although they are true, as I said, of most of the kids that I have worked with. And the first of those is learning disabilities. Although only about 10% of the adolescent population overall has learning disabilities, more than 50% of delinquents do. So it's not surprising to me when I interview a young person to find that they have significant processing problems, a great deal of difficulty digesting information, and a lot of difficulty being organized in setting priorities or in planning ahead. Sometimes these have been addressed through special education services, although for lots of kids in poorer schools, they have not been on an IEP. Regardless, their disabilities affect them during the offense. Very often they're way behind in processing what's going on. So it's quite possible that this 14-year-old in the getaway car really wasn't with it when the others in the car were talking about going in and ripping off the convenience store. And that the kid in the car was way behind in processing what the group was actually planning to do. For many kids with these serious disabilities, they come from prenatal substance exposure, and they may have outgrown some of their disabilities by adulthood, but certainly they are amenable to teaching specialized instructional services that are provided in many juvenile facilities across the country. So we see kids who come in to a juvenile facility reading at the 2nd or 3rd grade level with considerable impairment because of disabilities, leaving 3 to 4 years later reading at the high school level and being much more aware of how their processing problems get in the way and how to compensate for them. Lastly, in this 3-part developmental framework is trauma, and the one that's really been given the least amount of attention, and of course is one that can influence a young person, again, at the time of their offense, but is crucial to have treated in order to reduce a lot of the behaviors that we see in delinquents when they enter a delinquency facility or an adult prison. When I did a study of 50 kids who I evaluated, some in juvenile court, some in adult court, 48 of them had significant multiple trauma in their histories before this arrest. For many of them, that was physical or sexual abuse, but for a shockingly large number, by the age of 14, 15, or 16, they had experienced the death of a parent. Many of them had a parent from whom they were separated because of that parent's imprisonment, and for many, they had been exposed to violence in their home, as well as losing many friends to violence on the street. This kind of repeated trauma results in kids who, first of all, are typically depressed and haven't had treatment for depression, which affects their functioning, both in terms of peer interaction as well as cognitive processing at the time of the offense. Many of them treat their own depression by numbing themselves with substances that protect them from having to think about the memories of abuse or the memories of the deaths that they have experienced. And of course, the consequences of their substance abuse are many, not only affecting school achievement, but at the time of the offense, very often they're in an altered state that doesn't enhance their already poor decision making. Many of the kids that I see are very reactive to threat because they have been victimized throughout their lives. So they tend to be triggered when other kids tease them, when adults threaten them in a way that for a kid who hasn't been victimized, they wouldn't react. They would just say, well, that's an adult that I want to stay away from. But these are kids who often do react by violent acts or aggressive acts, and that's often what gets them arrested. Just want to, so when I look at a teenager, when I think about that 14-year-old in the getaway car of a felony murder, I try to examine individually how is immaturity affecting him at the time of the offense, how is trauma affecting him, and how might disabilities have been affecting him. And I do that partly to understand what happened during the offense. This, of course, is very hard to get presented in court if you're doing an adult trial. And so very often this kind of developmental analysis of the kid's thinking at the time never gets presented if the kid has been direct filed and doesn't have a waiver or transfer hearing where the judge could hear about their life, about their functioning, about their compromised processing because of disabilities or because of trauma. In addition, of course, I'm interested in trauma, disabilities, and immaturity because of their impact on two other things before we even get to the question of disposition. And that is their functioning at the time of arrest. So immaturity plays a big role in kids' waiver of Miranda and in their quote-unquote decision to give a statement, as do disabilities and trauma. And they're very important to examine in considering what happened during police questioning. And in addition, immaturity, disabilities, and trauma really affect the ability of a young person to assist counsel. They may want to assist, and they may try very hard to work with their defender. But being unable, for example, to think ahead enough, think ahead further than 6 months, really makes a kid unable to intelligently consider a plea that looks ahead for 5 years. For a kid to say, oh sure, 5 years of adult probation, I can stay arrest-free for that long when they're 15. That's a third of their life that they're making this kind of prediction for, when we know that the likelihood of their getting arrested again for something minor is very high. So you have to raise a question of whether that kid can competently agree to that plea, let alone the kid who I'm working with right now who agreed to a plea to a homicide when he was 15 of 80 years because it was presented to him as a deal because he wouldn't get life. And because of his disabilities, his immaturity, the fact that he had no family connections, and had a terrible trauma history that meant that he just felt this was one more thing in his life that had occurred, he wasn't able to say to himself, most people don't live past 80 years. How could that be a bargain when I'm starting off, that I would be starting this off at the age of 15, this sentence. So fortunately, he has someone who is now helping him rethink that after he's done 10 years in adult prison as a result of the attention that's now been paid to juvenile life without parole sentences because of the Supreme Court decision. So he heard about it and was able to get in contact with the court, which gave him a hearing to reconsider whether or not he was able to sign on to that plea. Lastly, the obvious application of this developmental framework is to the services that would make a young person less likely to commit offenses after they were incarcerated. And that's obvious to you, that if you figure out how immaturity, disabilities, and trauma figured into the offense, that gives you the life picture of this young person, and you could prescribe educational services, therapeutic services, and some services just to enhance maturity. The problem is that you might not have an opportunity to present that anywhere, because if the young person has been direct filed, then the court may have no alternatives other than mandatory sentences that wouldn't involve considering whether this disability could be treated or whether the prison facility would have a special education program to which this young person is entitled for 7 more years of their life. So it's crucial to have not only excellent juvenile services, but a hearing, a waiver or transfer hearing, where the court could not only listen to this explanation about how the kid got to the offense, but then learn about whether this young person is likely to be rehabilitated with these services. It's often assumed by the direct file legislators around the country that kids who commit serious offenses during adolescence are likely to become adult violent offenders. And there's absolutely no research that supports that conclusion. And in fact, quite a bit of research supporting the opposite conclusion led the Center for Disease Control to issue a report that said that not only is it not good for kids to go to adult prisons in terms of services, but actually it doesn't reduce the likelihood of their committing adult offenses. The vast majority of teenagers who are arrested do not go on to become adult offenders. And in a study in the state of Washington, they found that of a large group of teenagers who were convicted as juveniles of violent offenders, only 20% of them were later convicted of an adult violent offense. So you're starting there with a very specific population of juvenile violent offenders and saying, but most of them, 80% of them, don't get arrested as adults for violent offending. And that's not at all the belief that you would be given looking at the direct file laws around the country.